Chiedo ora ad Alberto Martinelli,
I would now ask Mr. Alberto Martinelli, Professor of Politics and Sociology at the University of Milan, to please join me here on the podium. Mr. Martinelli has contributed, thanks to his long experience of research in the field of international politics, to the success of this project and has personally looked after the contents of the session that is about to begin on the topic Europe between Federalism and Nationalism. Please, Mr. Martinelli, introduce the theme and the contents that will be tackled during the round table.
Grazie, buongiorno a tutti.
Thank you very much and good morning.
Credo che il nesso tra il tema
I think that the connection between the theme of Europe and peace is very clear.
L'ha già spiegato molto bene Umberto Veronesi.
This has already been explained very well by Mr. Veronesi. Our conviction is that a European Union which is strong, which is cohesive, can be a global player, can be a player of the international scene. And we think that it can build peace. So it is very important for this Europe DNA to develop, as we said. It's very important to be fully developed. But we also know that there are growing perplexities, growing doubts, and sometimes even open hostility vis-à-vis this European project. I'd like to mention just a couple of facts, a couple of recent events, but I could mention many more of them. About a month ago, the National Parliament was voted in Austria, and the three parties, the three anti-Europeans, and not Eurosceptics, they were anti-European. The three of them together obtained more than 30% of the votes, which means that also one voter is anti-European. One voter out of three is anti-European in Austria. And we're talking about a country that only received benefits from the European Union. The day before, yesterday, the leader of the Front National Français, Marine Le Pen, stipulated an alliance with Geert Wilders, who is the leader of the Freedom Party in the Netherlands, to set up in the future European Parliament that we will elect next spring an anti-European group within the European Parliament, trying to put together also other anti-European parties, from that of Nigel Farage and to other Scandinavian parties, the ones in Finland, for instance. Normally these are all either called parties for freedom or parties for the great something. So this idea of always setting up and creating a new alternative. But in reality, these are just proposals of old political events and ventures. For this reason, I think it was important to critically analyze the phenomenon of nationalism and also of populism, because my thesis is that these movements, these parties, can be defined as national populistic parties. And where the two converge practically is precisely in the anti-European attitude, anti-Euro, but also anti-European institutions. So I would like to briefly define practically what I mean by nationalism and by populism, and I'd like to explain why and what are the causes behind this revival, this rebirth, the strong rebirth of these movements and parties. And after this, I will try to understand what the possible antidote can be so as to avoid that the growth of these parties may hamper the European project and would force us to go backwards again, to go. Nationalism in general terms is the ideology of a nation, of the national state rather. And the national state, as you know, is one of the great political innovations of modern Europe, which then extended itself and spread out to the rest of the world. As such, it affirms a sovereignty, independence, and also the unity of a national community. This is a general formula. But there is then also a more specific formula, which is some kind of strong nationalism, which concerns parties and movements that can be defined as nationalistic. And they affirm something more than this. That is, basically, there are three types of claims here. The first one is that of identity. They divide reality in us and they. So we or us are the member of the same nations. We must have very strong consistence in terms of from an ethical point of view, language point of view, political, cultural point of view, and which in this way underscore the consistence which exists between the nation and the political entity, which is the state. This identity claim, which differentiates us from them, normally believes that the differences which exist between us and them are much greater than the similarities, than what we have in common, and that we are better than they are. Second claim is instead time, connected to time. Nationalistic speeches are absolutely obsessed by the concern of offering an authentic version of national history. Obviously, this is a history of national glories. It suffers from omissions, from amnesias. It tries to shelve and put aside all of those aspects which are not consistent practically with this, let's say, authentic version. That has to be a good one, entirely good one, the genius, the virtues of this or that other country. And then there are claims instead which are connected to space, a strong connection with the territory, in the sense that it is believed that there is some kind of inextricable connection between the nation and the territory, because the territory forges the character, and because it would possess the signs of an ongoing presence in the centuries of that, that specific population on that specific territory. The role that nationalism as ideology has carried out in European history, because I deal with these phenomena in the European framework, has been quite ambivalent. It has certainly contributed in fueling, in motivating people, patriots, for instance, who have tried to build national states. So the states of those nations that arrived later on in history, such as ours or Germany, it consolidated national states of more ancient date. And in this respect, it also carried out a very important function in modern society, because it contributed to solidarity, to national solidarity, in a society which is the modern industrial one, which is made up of individuals that compete so as to achieve their very legitimate aspirations. In a society of individuals, it's much more difficult to guarantee the necessary consensus to pursue collective goals. And so in the historical period in which solidarity, traditional solidarity was, and traditional identities were becoming weaker, the village, for instance, community, the religious community, there was a risk of having an excess of individualism, a lack of solidarity, and hence you see that national solidarity filled in this vacuum, let's say. And so this was a positive function because it contributed to social cohesion, apart from the fact of obviously being able also to achieve a national independence. Let's think about Our Risorgimento, for instance, in Italy. But then nationalism became an aggressive type of nationalism, an expansionistic one that denied other populations to pursue their self-determination, to express their political will that had been established for the members of their own community. And so in this respect, nationalisms unfortunately largely contributed to wars, especially the terrible wars of the first half of the past century. After obviously the killings of the Great War, nationalisms did not become weaker. They, on the other hand, continued with more aggressiveness which culminated in the great tragedy and the shame of the Shoah, in the killings in the Second World War, and all of the various injustice acts and crimes. It was thought, and I'm talking about Europe now, so it was thought that at the end of the Second World War, after this tragic experience, finally those aggressive, violent nationalisms, intolerant nationalisms, finally were declining, and the European project stems, in fact, from the will of putting a full stop to intra-European wars that should be defined as civil wars, because I consider Europe as a single great nation, and so we could call them civil wars. And then nationalism continued in the rest of the world in various movements that were anti-colonialistic movements that led to the independence of many former colonies, so even positive trends, let's say, in this respect. But let's talk about Europe. Why is it that after so many decades from the end of the Second World War, why is it that we find again parties, movements, intellectuals that support theses that belong to that harsh, aggressive, intolerant nationalism that wants this convergence between the political entity and a consistent, homogeneous national, let's say, identity? Well, the causes are different. As far as what happens in the Eastern or Central and Eastern Europe, a fundamental cause has been, I believe, the end of the Cold War. So the clash between the two superpowers. In the so-called bipolarism era, so this world balance around two poles, US and USSR, we had two global models confronting themselves of different societies, different economies, different political systems, different ideologies. You know very well the representative democracy. We had market capitalism, and the other one was a planned one. We had liberal democratic, social democratic ideologies, Stalinist economy on the other. So a total contraposition. In this contraposition, the conflicts, the regional, local conflicts are those of a nationalistic nature that had ethnical roots or religious roots, were to some extent reabsorbed or re-included in the framework of this great contraposition. They didn't disappear, but they were sort of latent at that point. And what they resurfaced when the Soviet Union imploded, and Cold War finished, bipolarism finished. This is a reason that concerns, above all, a part of this issue. As far as the other countries are concerned, instead we need to refer to globalization processes. These processes that obviously have led to a series of benefits and costs. A cost-benefit analysis can be done starting off from a given point of view. It depends on the point of view of whom we assess them. But in general terms, we can say that this has entailed certain difficulties, for instance, in the preservation of welfare systems and welfare policies that were far too expensive, and that created a lot of insecurity, anxiety, difficulties, beyond the fact of engendering feelings of sort of disconcert, and so rediscovery of one's own root. And within this general theme, to reassess your own national identity in a strong way corresponds to one of the possible answers that may take place. But everything became much more complicated once the crisis hit hard, because the crisis increased insecurity, increased fears that we all know very well, increased unemployment as well. And once again, what further increased is this research for solidarity within a community. And also the need to identify some very easy scapegoats, which are always others, which may be immigrants taking jobs away, rather than they can be, let's say, privileged subjects of social policies, which leads to, let's say, the chauvinism of welfare. The welfare is okay if it has an impact on those who were born here for generations, not other ones. Or it can also lead to identify as the scapegoat European institutions that are too distant. They are technocrats, they're too cold, they decide for our future without even having been democratically elected. And then there's one further set of causes which concerns the way in which the European project has been developed. A successful project, and I insist on saying this precisely in a moment in which skepticism is on the rise, but I would call it a successful project, one of the most important projects of contemporary history, the creation of a supranational, let's say, nation structure that saw shares of sovereignty move, but a process which was not completed, which was incomplete, a process which started off with certain basic contradictions, of which two are certainly connected to the issue of nationalism, that is the fact of wanting to build a supranational union that could replace states over time, so the governments of the member states, but precisely through the action of these governments of these member states. And today, in the governance system of Europe, what is the institution that enjoys more power? It's the European Council, the Council of Ministers, with the heads of states, obviously. So basically, this is the body where the heads of states, the ministers of the member states are represented, and so they represent the point of view of the member states themselves. They don't ask themselves about the problem of European interest, the general interest. And the second basic contradiction is this. They have seen a growth in the share of decisions that can be made on a supranational level compared to the national level, even below that, progressively transferring competencies, responsibilities, without there being a simultaneous and concomitant transfer of commitment and loyalty on the part of the citizens of member states by their national states to this supranational European political system. I'd also like to add, still have some time, I'd also like to add that these parties and movements practically are particularly effective, even if we can't really exaggerate their relevance, because the Austrian case at this point is really an isolated case, and even because it's very likely that in the next European Parliament, representativeness of the so-called Eurosceptical parties may increase, or the anti-European parties, they will certainly remain a minority. But I would say that, generally speaking, this growth is threatening. It is threatening because it uses very boldly, without too many precautions, all of the topics connected to populism that has a lot in common with nationalism. And I define this party national populistic, even though I realize that many of these subjects are populistic but not nationalistic, and some are vice versa, not nationalistic, because they use the very few arguments connected to populism. And what does populism has rhetorically in terms of the style of political communication? It uses the topic of national interest to a large extent. That I'm going to use a slogan that maybe you might use, that of being masters in your own home, of being the owners, the masters, finding scapegoats for scapegoats elsewhere, and resorting to theses connected to possible plots of elites that are sort of making plans against us.
So national feelings are very strong, and they retrieve to populistic ideas and logics. There is then another aspect, which is the most interesting one. The populism of contemporary Europe is not anti-democratic. It has a very close relationship with democracy, and somebody who may be critic in this respect may say that these movements and parties are parasites. In more neutral terms, they say that they are the true Democrats. The party elites have betrayed democracy. We are the real alternative, be it the democracy of the networks or the democracy that participates from the very bottom. Well, they always resort to elitarian concept, and people seem to be fighting against elites, as they would like to work in favor and fight in favor of democracy. Populist movements in contemporary Europe are not anti-democratic, which is a good thing. They're very similar to those movements that have led to totalitarian regimes. But they are surely anti-liberal. I'm not saying anti-liberists, but anti-liberal, which means that those who have received the vote, which means that they are the majority in power, they can do what they want because they have a mandate from the people. Thus neglecting that we are living in liberal democracies, meaning, as Article 1 of our Constitution says, sovereignty stays with the people. So pertains to people, this is the democratic meaning of it, and the people will exercise it within the limitations and the framework of Constitution. This is the liberal part of it. No citizen can be considered as being above the law. Everybody is subject to the law. And then another topic is that of the small people as opposed to the big guys or small states as opposed to big nations and states. These are rhetorical tools that are being used also by other parties that cannot be defined as national populist parties. But everybody is using this concept nowadays because it is a topic for political propaganda that is very strong. So these statements do have in themselves some real forms of criticism. For example, criticizing the current government system in the European Union that in fact has a demographic deficit, has given too much power to some elites of technocrats, and this is a real and justified form of criticism. Main Street is against Wall Street. This was one of the fundamental slogans of Mr. Barack Obama's campaign, who was using and retrieving resorting to populist topics. So this is very true, this is a fact.
Ci sia un malessere delle democrazie contemporanee, ci sia disagio, ci siano elementi di crisi, è assolutamente vero. Il problema è l'uso strumentale che si fa di questi difetti per affermare una alternativa politica
that there is a political alternative that I would say it's even worse than
a pensare
the evil itself.
Erroneamente
in fact, they wrongly believe still today that in today's world, in the globalized world,
risposta politica
the
che si possa
best
dare è quella che può
political
dare uno
response
Stato
we may
nazionale
give is
con una popolazione
the response to
omogenea,
a national state with a homogeneous population from a cultural and social standpoint.
Di varare politiche, prendere decisioni che scarichino il costo sugli altri.
Take decisions that then will
your neighbor.
Act according to the beggar your neighbor's principle.
E invece è esattamente il contrario, la società in cui viviamo,
the opposite
le società
applies
in cui vivono i 7
fact,
miliardi
society
e più
where we live and the
di esseri
societies where
umani
we
sulla Terra oggi,
today more than 7 billion people are multi-ethnical, multicultural societies with very strong population flows.
Individui che hanno identità plurime.
People with multiple identities that do not exclude one another mutually. So they are political entities that are more effective. We believe that in this respect, the federal unions can play an important role, like India, Brazil, Russia. There are exceptions, of course, but this is the right direction in order to overcome the crisis, which is not yet over, unfortunately. This economic crisis then turned into the soaring debt and then employment crisis and so on and so forth. Well, needs coordinated efforts and replies to these issues that we can only provide at the level of the European Union, and more democratic union, a less technocratic union at the same time. That is where one can concentrate on effective answers to these problems. The fact that each one of the 28 countries can come to solutions, set aside the subnational solutions like Padania, the Po Valley solutions, or the Flemish solutions, well, those are not effective. Let me conclude by saying how can we fight against these trends? Well, I'm surprised to see that European parties have started off their campaign for the next spring period right now. Many other countries are being silent in this respect. I'm not referring to Italy. Italy has considered the European election for the purpose of testing the strength of their own political parties at the national and international scale, but actually we should say very clearly what the topics are that go in favor of a reinforcement of Europe, not to the detriment of it. And I will leave it to this part, to the debate that will follow suit my presentation. And I'd like to stress that there will be different stages in the process of review of the treaties. As you know, the European Union is the political institutional result of a series of treaties that have been undersigned by the member states' governments. So treaties have to be reviewed. It is called the fundamental law, and it's thousands and thousands of pages that have to be reviewed and reformed according to certain
molti hanno le loro proposte da fare,
proposals. I have mine and others have got surely many more, but the objective is to make them all known to everybody. While at the same time we should not disregard some of the populist topics, as there are people that make an excessive use of it. I believe we should try and
la differenza sarebbe che spetterebbe l'onere di
provide
con i dati, con argomenti seri, che quello che si afferma è vero.
Our statements on the basis of solid foundations. More Europe, for example, means less taxes.
È solo un aspetto di questo.
And I would like to give you an idea of what I mean by that. Let's consider the major savings one may have by replacing 28 military expenditure budgets, a single budget for a single European army. One of the proposals that Science for Peace has put forward for a long time and is still fostering. Thank you very much.
Ringraziamo il professor Martinelli.
Thank you, Professor Martinelli, for your very clear, interesting presentation. And now the first session shall start, Europe between Federalism and Nationalisms, and I would like to ask Andrea Vianello, the writer and moderator of this session, to join me to the stage, please.
Allora, buongiorno, tra poco faremo entrare gli ospiti per questa sessione che cercherà
Shortly
di
we will
abbiamo sentito
have the guests of this session here. So from, as Professor Martinelli said, we will be working in this direction. I have the responsibility for the public service we provide as journalists to also consider communication issues on the concept of Europe and on the meaning of being Europeans. So we have to tackle many issues and problems that have to do with the wrong form of communication, something we have to try and avoid for the future or to improve for the better. Nationalism, as Professor Martinelli mentioned earlier, goes very often hand in hand with populism, and these viruses are also becoming widespread in Italy too. And we heard a few minutes ago that the European Union may vote against the stability law. The opinion of the European Union was very skeptical of the ways we manage the government, and level of rigorosity may be intertwined with these new viruses that are affecting the whole of Europe with peaks and laws here and there. And now the guests that I would like to call to the stage
insegna politiche sociali e del lavoro all'Università degli Studi di Milano,
molto si occupa del Labour policy at the University of Milan deals with welfare, and we have realized that the system that is no longer suitable for the purpose is one of the causes of the problems we have in this Europe, which is no longer united as it should be. Professor Ferrera, is Professor Ferrera in the backstage? If Professor Ferrera shouldn't be ready, then we can call the second speaker. Here he comes. Welcome. And thank you, yes.
L'ultima poltroncina.
So you can take a seat over there. And now we have a Professor of International Relations at the Reading University, Great Britain. She has conducted studies on some of the nationalist movements. Professor Daphne is from Greece. Alberto is one of these movements. She is also concentrated and focused on the movements we have in Italy, Casa Pound. I'm talking about Professor Daphne Halikiopoulou. I'm sure I mispronounced it, but you will forgive me. And of course, last but not least, we will have the author of Mal di Nazione, i.e. Professor Alberto Martinelli, who has just had the floor a few minutes ago. So you will be sitting here, and I will be next to you. In the first place, I would like to stress that we will now have a debate, a Q&A session in a way, and you, of course, can help us along and contribute with your questions to the roundtable discussion. So how can we interact with how can everybody interact with the speakers, with the roundtable discussion? You can do it via Twitter, Facebook, so you can see what you should use as an account on Twitter. You can ask questions in using 140 letters as a maximum. There's a question corner where you can ask your questions in writing or verbally, or send your questions to the site you see mentioned on the screen. Whatever you will write will be read by myself here on the stage. Hence, we will have a very interactive session, because we want this to be a very interactive conversation moment. But before we start, here is a video.
Vediamo.
The concept of nation, even if we think is connaturate in the history, is quite recent, a couple of centuries, from the French Revolution, where the concept of nation, meant as community of people sharing a language and a history, starts to mix up with the concept of a state. Today it's something that's taken for granted, and we use the two words as a synonym, but it wasn't so in the past. The idea of uniting state and nation changed the history of Europe, laid the foundations for the revolutions of the forthcoming centuries, and led to the birth of nations as we know them today. In nature, there never is an action without a reaction, and the same drive that led populations to be united also allowed for devastating conflicts. The First World War was a bonfire, then this energy continued and ended up in the terrible Second World War conflict. Only at the end of this, Europe started a process of building of the European Union that put an end to centuries of civil wars on the continent. After the implosion of the Soviet Union, there were new nationalistic drives which emerged. The false idea that states can make it on their own, the fact that they didn't like interdependence, which meant maybe having your hands tied, the integration of different races. All this went against the idea of a European Union, which hasn't yet been completed and which is not a political union yet. Now, in the midst of an unprecedented economic crisis, with the risk of a default, Europe is faced with choices that it can no longer postpone: integration or give up to nationalism. Which one of these avenues will we choose?
Eccoci. Insomma, cosa vince l'unione o il rischio di
So back we are again, a risk of disgregation, or as Einstein put it, that nationalism is the measles of people. It's a child disease of nations. So measles, is it the new disease that Europe is experiencing? Is it too young a Europe, or is it an even major problem? Is it maybe a tumor?
Professor Ferrera, you have the floor. As you mentioned Einstein, we could also say it's easier to break down an atom rather than a nation. Nations, as Alberto Martinelli put it before, in spite of the fact that they may be relatively young in humankind's history, are social, political, institutional elements that are very compact indeed. So it's not easy to disassemble them, to destroy them, as they are the result of actions that have been built over time. Once you make Italy, you have to create the Italian society that was Massimo d'Azeglio's statements, not Cavour's statements, as many believe. Well, the making of Italy means carrying out a process of language standardization, cultural standardization, mass schooling projects, military service and army organization. So we see now the resurrection of the few aspects that are related to the traditional nations, for example, the Netherlands and Austria rediscovering nationalism. And of course, we also have to do with a series of member states that have accessed the Union in the last decade, the former Eastern Socialist bloc countries that
come tarpato per lunghi decenni appunto di dominazione sovietica
that for long that due to the Soviet domination could not express their national spirit, so they now have become national states, and they cannot wait to provide evidence that they can reinforce and strengthen some identity elements that, as Martinelli put it before, are the binding element within a nation. So the enlargement to Eastern countries that has seen the accession in 2004, 2007, 2013 with Croatia, all those countries ranging from the Baltic Sea to the Balkans have made things even more difficult today. So, and this would have been as difficult in spite of the fact that you might not have had a crisis, an economic crisis. So, of course, the integration process has been accelerated via new treaties. And we will talk about the meaning of this crisis and the
con una quindicina di Paesi membri che sono ridiventati Stati-nazione da poco, fa molto più fatica a intraprendere un processo di
policy of rigor. So these compact blocks, the national states, are being merged, and of course it's not easy to do this, and we have to consider these aspects. It would have been much easier if Europe had been set up only by 12 or 15 member states. Okay, can you please turn the microphones to my side and the screen to my side so I can see everything better? And Professor Halikiopoulou, I know I'm mispronouncing, I'm sorry. But I'd like to know whether we are underestimating the movements that Professor Martinelli mentioned earlier. They may be far away from our country, maybe, but I said when I introduced you that you have been concerned with some nationalist movements in nations that have a long-standing tradition, for example, in Greece, Alberto, and in Italy, Casa Pound, which is a minority movement. Fortunately, in Italy, luckily enough, it is a minority. Do you believe that we're underestimating the risk of a nationalism in Europe?
Okay, thank you. Forgive me, but my Italian is very, very rusty, so I'm going to do this in English, and I'm struggling to get the whole conversation with my headphones. But I think what is interesting about nationalism in Europe is that we can't make a broad generalization. We talked about nationalism as a disease. Are we underestimating nationalist movements? Well, what's interesting is that they are taking place differently under different circumstances. So while we can talk about the dire consequences of nationalism in Greece with the rise of the Golden Dawn, we can't say the same for other crisis-ridden countries like Spain, which is not experiencing the rise of any nationalist or populist movement. Perhaps Platforma per Catalonia has got a marginal local support, but that's about it. And maybe the Republic of Ireland has never had a far-right-wing movement and does not have a far-right-wing movement now with the economic crisis. Portugal never developed. The Partido Nacional Renovador is very marginalized in the party system. Whereas, on the other hand, Greek Golden Dawn, as you probably know, at the moment, well, they're in prison at the moment, but before they went into prison, they have 18 seats out of 300 in parliament, and we're talking about a very different movement than your Lega Nord or even the Casa Pound. We're talking about a violent neo-Nazi group that is staunchly anti-immigrant, that is violent grassroots. So why? And then you talked about the Netherlands, for example, but again, we're seeing a very different type of nationalist populist movement. Geert Wilders' party is one that doesn't stress immigration as a question of race, but stresses immigration as a question of liberty and freedom. So we don't accept foreigners not because they're of a different race than us, but because they espouse different ideologies that are intolerant to our tolerant society. So I think that perhaps what we're underestimating, or we're not quite clear, as to why different nationalist populist movements take different form and what it is that makes them rise in the very different circumstances of Europe.
Questo è quello che noi stiamo sottovalutando.
So this is what we're underestimating currently. Professor Martinelli, I would like to go back to the Italian situation. Professor Daphne just mentioned two very different problems with the Casa Pound, a very tiny movement, and the Lega Nord, the Northern League, that has been a party in government with a very territorial structure and flavor. Is this virus closely linked to the word populism rather than nationalism? Do we have a way of expressing this form of uneasiness that is making us rediscuss the concept of the European Union?
Intanto distinguerei, appunto, come abbiamo detto,
well, I would like to draw a distinction and these subspecies of the national populist movements belonging to the extreme right wing are not the most important part of anti-European national populist movement. In Italy, in particular, we have some populist parties and movements that do not use the nationalist rhetoric. The Northern League is doing so. How can we say that the Northern League is a nationalist country when we consider that they want to disgregate or disjoint Padania from the rest of the country? Padania is a nation. Why do they say nation? Well, actually, the Northern League in Italy is very similar to the Flemish party. They want to reaffirm the Flemish nation as against or as opposed to the Belgian state, maybe to then become united with Holland for language reasons. So the Five-Star Movement is using very strong ideas that go back to the populist concept, but I do not see any nationalist idea behind it. It's a nationalist concept. As far as these movements are concerned within the European political scenario from right to left, well, there is a prevalence of these movements on the right-hand side of the political environment. But there are such movements in the left parties. There is not just Green Golden Dawn in Greece, but also Arisa, that they had won the first elections, then and the Link, the radical German party that was set up by the former Democrats and the former Eastern Germans, are the most anti-European party in Europe, if we set aside Alternative für Deutschland, and they are a left-wing party, so this has to be considered. But I do agree with you, we could open a long debate on the nationalist idea and the concept of nation as well. So this should be considered as an antidote. Now we have got a vaccine against measles. But this can be dangerous for health as well. I will go back to Professor Ferrera and ask the extent to which the economic crisis is the reason for this crisis, or vice versa. Well, it's a very important cause, or a concomitant cause. In fact, European legislation has proceeded quite swiftly in the course of time, in spite of the fact that and avoid sovereignty, national governments were being sent to Brussels because Europe was a producer of well-being. It was seen as a gentle force, as Padua Schiappa puts it. So,
le politiche di coordinamento, le politiche di integrazione del mercato consentiva ai Paesi membri di
the member states could be better off, be in a better condition, grow faster, and the proceeds or the results could be paid out via structural funds, for example, to make the economic conditions in the different countries more homogeneous. Let's consider, for example, the role that structural funds have played in Spain, Portugal, Greece, Ireland. There are countries that have been able to fund their own development in the last 30 years thanks to this growth dividends produced by the process of European integration. Europe and integration have been the driving force for development and growth, but this engine at a certain moment has ceased, and due to the problems of the monetary union. So it's a manufacturing defect, really. Yes, it is. And on the other side, a tsunami, a financial crisis came about. The financial crisis that broke out in the United States also affected the whole countries of the European Union, which means that this defect of manufacturing defect, as you called it, as well as the exogenous trends of globalization, have given the impression that Europe is no longer a force that is able to create a condition of well-being. It has become instead a navel that imposes cuts to the welfare system, that gives you a lot of homework to do at home, and has divided the European region into the good and the bad guys, and nobody likes, of course, that definition, and it is very hard, in fact, to establish who's got to be blamed, who's been the good guy and who's been the bad guy. So
dovuta al difetto di
fabbricazione e la crisi esogena dovuta a una accelerazione perversa, quella che ha fatto scoppiare la bolla finanziaria, ha ingenerato questa idea che l'Europa the economy, i.e. the financial bubble, has given rise to the idea that Europe is at the very origin of these condition of uneasiness in Europe. For example, the opening of the borders is seen as the reason for companies to get settled in other countries, to delocalize production, and the fact that there is a migration towards the richest countries with the more generous welfare state in order to opportunistically exploit the higher extent of generosity of the German, French or English welfare system is becoming a problem. And Austria, Germany, England, and France have written to the European Union asking to close the frontiers, the European frontiers, and take measures to limit the access to the national welfare system to those migrants that, in spite of the fact that they are coming from the European Union and should be part of the same political system, so to prevent these migrants to have access to the healthcare system and the likes. So we are faced with the crisis that has eroded the assumed consensus that has accompanied the process of the European Union, and is generating the opposite of all these, i.e. the closing of the borders so as to prevent the forms that have been with us for many years. So many people say the United States of Europe should be created now. It seems a paradox as the situation seems to be so fragile. So I'd like to know from Professor Daphne how important is the sentiment of fear, the economic crisis or the bad phase of this rigor, the fear of losing the welfare system. Is it fear the real thing that the Europeans have to do with in this very moment in Europe?
Okay. Sorry about the delay, but you know how it is. You mentioned the welfare system, and I think that's very interesting, because one thing that the economic crisis is doing that is linked to the rise of these populist movements, even of the left, not only of the right, that you spoke of, is the issue of nationalism as the question of who has access to the collective goods of the state. And the collective goods of the state is welfare. So one of the things that is very linked is, okay, so all these immigrants, all these foreigners, should they now have access to the collective goods that our nation is producing only for the members of our nation? And this is a very successful argument. So, for example, who should have access to free health when all these resources have been cut and therefore there isn't pensions? Free education. These are issues that are very, very critical, and a lot of right-wing, even left-wing movements in Europe are at the moment using this. So, you know, it's okay, we don't want to exclude people again on the basis of their race, but welfare is important. Fear of losing the resources of the state that you are entitled to. So I do think that that is a big problem, but again, if you look at variation, this isn't taking place similarly everywhere. So I wonder to what extent this is the key determining factor.
Qual è secondo lei, professor?
And according to you, I absolutely agree that when things go well, even in a family, it's much easier to agree on decisions, because obviously everybody draws advantages from agreeing. And for a long time, the slogan was precisely this: Europe is convenient. Now there is a crisis instead. And in a crisis, and this can also occur within a family, within a group, not necessarily only within a supranational community. Everybody can think that it's much better to be on your own when you're in a crisis. The stronger one because they think that they have more resources, the weaker one because they find somebody who protects them. But this is just an illusion. So I think that we are now at a crucial turning point. Either Europe will go backwards and it will remain a big area of free trade, which is excellent, or it has to make that further step and finally complete all of the missing part. Even the creation of the euro, of the single currency, has been quite daring, but those who have supported it haven't made a mistake. They said, okay, we'll do it, because then it will be necessary to add other things. A fiscal policy, an expenditure policy. Obviously, it's daring. It's a risk because it could cause the situation to explode. For this reason, and I really like the introduction, the way you referred to responsibility of the media. In my book, I very much dwell on this as saying that media can contribute greatly in terms of the schooling system, the university system, in creating at least a sense of common problems, of having common problems, a feeling that we're all on the same boat, that we need to solve things together rather than one against the other. Then obviously here we could discuss about specific proposals. Yes, I was thinking, for instance, talking about the euro, and now maybe we will talk about this. This has become almost an enemy for those who want to fuel anti-European, whilst it's seen as the shelter from those that say, okay, watch out, if we lose Europe, it will be a catastrophe. Obviously, there's a dominant economic theory that supports the euro as something that will save us, and a minority instead that sees the euro as a ghost, as a spectre. The risk of the mass media, such as TV, is that if you put the two theories on the same level, you risk flattening out things, and you can't neglect the presence, or obviously, of a minoritarian thought. But you can understand how difficult it is for us, because it's very easy to just, start a fire, which then becomes an enormous one. So, Mr. Ferrera, the management of the euro, I have coined the term manufacturing flaw, but in the way that euro has entered our life, is there this flaw, do you think, and should we sort of rearrange things? Well, in our lives, the euro has entered as a means, let's say, as a practical means, and for many years up to the explosion of the crisis, we were all quite proud, especially in the weaker countries, of being able to pay in this harder currency, which obviously also carried our symbols. Now that the crisis has exploded, the euro instead has become the scapegoat of many fears, of a lot of frustration that we mentioned before. So when it was created, the euro had this so-called manufacturing flaw, in the sense that it was pretty much present in the vision of its original architects, but this flaw was able, to some extent, to be mitigated by a long period of well-being, of growth, and so on. So what is this manufacturing flaw? It is the fact that a single currency cannot work in an economic territorial context which is characterized by very, very big gaps with respect to certain parameters of productivity, taxation, public expenditure. This is sort of overlooked, I would say, because these gaps enter in the single currency, taking with them a series of advantages or disadvantages which are very different. We entered, for instance, with a debt which was almost double that of Germany. So from the very start, it was unrealistic to think that just in a few years' time, with the famous rigor and homework that Angela Merkel talks about, that a country such as Italy or Greece that had entered with a much heavier burden than others, it was unthinkable to think that they, over a few years, were going to be able to become consistent, to become and converge, let's say, fully in a broader economy that had no stabilization mechanisms. All of the federal economies or federalized economies have a balance, obviously, from Canada to the US to Australia, obviously Germany, Switzerland, just to give you some examples, have a federal balance that works so as to mitigate these geographical differences which exist or which are created from the very beginning, these differences between different communities that are called states in the US, provinces in Canada, Länder in Germany. So in Europe, the euro was created without the stabilization mechanism. And when with the crisis it was said, we need this stabilization mechanism, mechanism because we had to do it quickly, because we had to do it in a moment of crisis, and also because certain countries found themselves faced with the fact that they needed to pay more than others. The creation of this stabilization mechanism occurred in a rather messy manner and rather slow manner as well. It didn't take place immediately, and obviously if we hadn't delayed in Greece's bailout as much as we waited, as much as the delay was, probably the problems would not have exploded if we would have been quicker in Greece's bailout. So the problems exploded, the crisis was not neutralized, and a figure that became political then succeeded against, I would say, all of the advice given by politicians of the time, if this person hadn't said something which in 24 hours saved the euro and desactivated the crisis. Now, I'm obviously referring to Mario Draghi's speech. With a sentence that lasted 30 seconds, he said, "I will do all it takes to save the euro," without spending a cent. With that simple sentence, which was you will find that sentence in the history books, I'm sure. And 5 minutes later, the German government was calling Draghi's, office, saying, "But what did you say?" without realizing that it was exactly what had to be said. Yes, talking about Germany, we often talk about the stepmother for Germany, and this leads us to see Europe as an entity dominated by this stepmother, as it is called. There's a nice question that we will ask Professor Daphne that comes through Twitter. I see that we have a lot of questions arriving, so we'll proceed. So is there a German responsibility in all this? What do you think, Professor Daphne?
Is there a German responsibility? I think I might shift it around to tell you that, for example, in Greece, which is a case I know well and I come from, the question of Germany is used so much. I don't know if anyone saw, but a year ago Angela Merkel came to visit Greece as part of the austerity measures and to discuss it. And so a lot of Greek people, members of both far right and far left and central parties, dressed up or rather showed or dressed up as Nazis, or showed big banners of Angela Merkel dressed as a Nazi and said no to Nazism, while at the very same time they voted 18 of those Nazis in their own internal parliament. So I think So I think the question is more how. Note this, Greece is the only country out of the crisis-ridden countries at the moment that was invaded in the Second World War by Germany. And it's an interesting narrative that is put through by all of our political actors, that Germany is this dominating power that sought to dominate us back in World War II and is seeking to dominate us now again. There's a lot of talk about how Germany in fact owes Greece a lot of money for compensation for the Second World War, and that's again used by Syriza, the far left party, and other parties. So I think that the question of Germany really gives a lot of tool for the rise of Greek nationalism across the political spectrum. Now, is there a German responsibility? Every country, if you like, every nation seeks their own national interest, and it is a question why the German taxpayer or any taxpayer would desire to pay money in order to bail out Greece. So that's internal political problems that are created. So Germany not only has to deal with the image that is portrayed to it externally, but it also has to deal with its own domestic political problems. How can it put forward this responsibility when it's got its own people? The politicians have their own people to please at the same time. So I think it's a very tricky question, but the way that it fuels nationalism is actually very interesting.
Yes, very interesting, because this is what takes us to the dramatic history of the 20th century that comes as an impetus wind, and obviously when we hear certain keywords being re-echoed of alleged dominions. Professor rightly said that we are in Europe and every country needs to respond in Europe to its voters and its interest. Professor Martinelli, I want to go back on this point. The European imbalance amongst countries that entered the classroom with their burden and were forced to go home and do their homework, and those instead who were all ready because they had done a good job in the previous years, obviously. Will this gap ever be filled? Unless, obviously, there will be a lot of generosity. I think this is a relevant problem, the problem of the imbalances with which these countries have entered the euro, but it is not a hurdle which cannot be overcome. There are lots of other federal unions that have a lot of gaps amongst the economies of the various regions, even greater than the gaps and inequalities that exist amongst the various member states of the European Union. I'm thinking about India, for instance, but also in the US itself. There are huge gaps and huge differences, much bigger than the ones we think, and we see them as a union. So yes, this is a problem, but it's certainly not an insurmountable one. The problem instead is that for our country and for other countries that have entered the Union with this burden, who were supposed to use the first years of the single currencies to tackle the problems and to solve or to fill that gap at least partially. Instead, we wasted these years. This is the problem. So obviously, it's all populist theory always says it's somebody else's fault, or it's the government's fault, it's the state's fault. Well, obviously, the state needs to meet my expectation, meet my needs. In terms of duties, I don't hear a lot about duties, I hear a lot about rights. There's a book by Rodotà, my dear friend and colleague, who said the right of having rights, which is a great sentence, but I would like to see a book saying the duties of having duties, maybe. This wouldn't be bad. And then it's not even our fault. The nationalist movements say it's not even the fault of our government because they serve a foreign power. And what power is this? It's Germany. Once again, luckily, because there are some positive elements, the Germans seem to have learnt the lesson from history. And so these governors, less so than the previous one, Angela Merkel, is much less than Adenauer or Helmut Kohl. They understood that Germany can once again play a crucial role in world politics only if it is within a greater container. Otherwise, it arouses and evokes dramatic memories and it unleashes a very strong opposition. But we are in a moment of crisis. Each one is trying to find scapegoats, and obviously there's enormous room for stereotypes. The Germans are selfish, the Greeks don't want to work. All of these stereotypes are fueled. Don't tell me what the Italians are, please. The Italians are a strange thing. Strange, that's what they are. Sometimes it saves us, sometimes it condemns us. But we shouldn't forget that Italy, in the European unification political process, played a very important role. Mediation role, which was very important indeed. So the fact of not being able today of doing this, I hope that we will go back having this role again, because obviously the political union of Europe is only made if there will be a fundamental agreement between Germany and France. But with other countries such as Italy, they have to play a key role in this respect. So the situation is not easy. But if we can convey the meaning and the importance of this choice, I think that finally we will be able to engage also the voters of our country. Do we risk, Mr. Ferrera, of not being able to direct the games? I have started the discussion here on the podium with the news that the European Union failed our stability draft, let's say, law, and this because they say that it doesn't respect the debt ceiling and it would jeopardize the balance, obviously. So obviously we have the unions against this maneuver, which are in the squares, which are down on the streets. Now, talking about United States of Europe, of Italy and its key role, I mean, are we doomed, or from crises could there be opportunities? Well, the latter, I think, is true. I haven't read this last news. I think that the European Commission will fail a lot of stability laws, not only ours. Furthermore, the European Union has the text that has entered Parliament on the 15th of October, and so they're sort of thinking on the past. We don't know what will come out of the Parliament with the approval of the stability law. Certainly, we will need to also consider the influential opinion of the European Commission. Alberto Martinelli is right when he says that Italy has carried out, especially in critical times in the history of European integration, an important mediation role. De Gasperi did so in the 50s, but this was also carried out by Andreotti in that other difficult moment, which was the Maastricht Treaty, when practically that compromise, that French-German compromise was forged that allowed for the reunification of Germany on the one hand, and on the other hand allowed for the birth of the euro, and therefore, let's say, the pegging of a greater Germany within the European framework. Europe must make some leap forwards. We do have these so-called manufacturing flaws. Probably we will have to review treaties. Why a new treaty? Because Europe is a little bit like a bicycle. If it doesn't continue going and pedaling, you fall off. And so you need to review the treaty. At least this will have to be done by the people remaining. It's very important for Italy to be there, for Italy to be credible, for Italy to be able to carry out this role of planning, of mediation that it has always done in the past. We need to get back on the horse again. I think that Prime Minister Letta, our Prime Minister, does have the potential of playing this card. Obviously, if he will be able to remain in office at least until the end of 2014, so until the end of the semester, the semester of our chair. And obviously, it will be a very delicate semester because we've just had the elections at the European Parliament, and certainly the consensus for Eurosceptical parties will grow. We will have also the new European Commission that will decide who will chair it, who will be the president, what the council will be, how the council will be composed, and to plan the work. So it's very important that not only we have our stability law now that will not jeopardize the objectives of the debt and so on, and doesn't make us and shouldn't appear as a new violation procedure on the deficit, but also when the moment will come in spring, we should have a national reform plan that has to be ambitious, has to be credible, and we should do one other thing, I believe, that is very interesting for young people who are here. The Letta government has worked very hard in Europe, even the Monti government, I must say, to put at the center of the agenda not only growth, but also employment, jobs. In June, they succeeded in mobilizing about 6 billion euro of the community balance to introduce this new scheme, this new plan, which is called Guarantee for Young People. Now, I do not hope that the Italian government will be capable, as of the 1st of January 2014, of having a plan which is credible and effective in using using this money that it will receive from Europe to create jobs for young people. I'm not sure about this, but it would be a way to waste this opportunity, I think, that of getting to the beginning of the European presidency, having really thrown away this opportunity. Yes. Questions now? I think that others will appear on the screen. I find it harder to read the names. This comes from Twitter, and this question is for Professor Halikiopoulou. It still talks about the problem of the Troika, which is the other stepmother word. So the Troika recipe for Greece risks having universities being closed. How can we explain to the Greeks that the European Union want their own good? So Professor Halikiopoulou, how can we help public opinion? This is a question from one of our participants. How can we help them understand that the European Union are trying to do their good when they close universities or when they jeopardize this possibility there?
I think it's very, very difficult to persuade Greeks that anyone is out there to do anything good for them. In fact, I think that I'm working on a paper right now on how confrontational Greek nationalism actually is. And one of the defining features, and I think we're perhaps overestimating the crisis just a little bit because these things are much exacerbated now. But Greek nationalism has been as such for a very, very long time. And generally, every outsider, I think it's perhaps even a historical product of our colonial past, but everyone is out there to get Greece, you see, and that's very, very prominent in the media. It's very, very prominent in the education system. If you read history textbooks, it's all about the evil Turks and the evil Germans and all the evil that are out there to get us. So I think that to change or to persuade public opinion of anything is not a very short-term matter, and it's not going to differ if some media news all of a sudden come out and just say something. I think it needs very long-term, long-standing policies, and for me the most important policy that can change things is education, because we have a compulsory single one textbook. Education is promoted by the state, which promotes an official narrative of nationalism and Greek identity, which is one portrayed as very threatened from all outsiders, one that is very staunchly orthodox and speaks the Greek language. So anyone else is an outsider and they're threatening to us. And the best way to stop that is to teach children from a very young age something different. So I think it will take a very long time for Greeks to be persuaded of anything.
E insomma, chiaramente non è che bisogna fare, come dire, propaganda, no? Bisogna
Obviously, we needed to choose a good way of communicating. We need to find a good way of communicating the true things, the good things. This is our job as journalists, I'm referring to. Another question, Professor Martinelli, how can we believe in the creation of a European army, which is one of the projects that of creating, let's say, a European strength, having seen the difference in foreign policy and the skepticism by many powers vis-à-vis a common army, which is the case of the UK, for instance, that has a different position. So do you think that these ideas risk jeopardizing the whole creation of federal Europe? I don't think this is impossible. This is an impossible objective. All in all, I think that it has less difficulties than that of having a common foreign policy, even if the two things are... Yes, this was my question, yes. I think that having a single army can be a way to facilitate the possibility of having a common foreign policy. So the foreign policy is not a precondition. So normally, a citizen would want to have efficient armed forces if they believe that they have rivals at their boundaries, and none of these 28 countries or the member states of the European Union can see others as rivals, enemies, or if they want to make their role credible within the world politics. But the European Union would be much more credible if it had, let's say, an army that does not mean the investments of the 28 budgets, but much less. And if it were to drastically cut military expenses to invest them elsewhere, education, research, and other things like these. In terms of integration, I would say that the various member states are quite already, the officials, the top army officials are already quite integrated. And obviously, the single European army encounters a lot of favors, even among citizens, more than other points. So this is not only desirable, I would say, but rather realistic as well, not unrealistic. Yes, I've seen banks as well. No, this is another one. I wanted to talk about economics. How can we present a positive project to young people? We can talk about this straight away. How can we present a positive project to young people that know very little about Europe today to avoid them falling in the, let's say, traps of nationalistic parties? Is there a certain detachment between Europe and young people? Is it easier for those generations who have gone through the war, even the second generation ones, because their parents had gone through it and so see in the appeasement of this continent as an objective which is to be considered extremely positive, compared instead to those generations who do not know what the war is, if not maybe having listened to their grandparents? Well, polls reveal that young people keep on being very much in favor of Europe, much more so than their parents or grandparents, especially young people from those countries that have recently become part of the Union, that is, those that have entered the Union over the past decade. So the issue of young people is crucial, because if there is a long-term, I would call it structural or demographic trend or dynamics that can take us out from nationalistic folds and accompany this process of rapprochement amongst the various European countries. This is linked to a generational turnover. And this on behalf of the workers, on behalf of the voters, but also on behalf of politicians. Because I think that they can become more interconnected, even more directly, even because of the anographical similarity, let's say, with the young people, for an agenda which could envisage a higher level of integration. Obviously, there's a problem of language, but the new media, mind you, will facilitate, I believe, a greater ease of communication amongst young people. First of all, because English is obviously spreading very rapidly, and in some countries, in some smaller countries, a lot of films are no longer dubbed. So young people practically learn to speak English and are perfectly accustomed to the sounds of the language since a very young age. I am told that in using some of these social media, it's quite easy to have an instantaneous translation into English of what is written. And the only thing I use is the Google Translator program, which, since the first times I used it, when it translated Bocconi University as a University Bocconi mouthful university. Well, since then it's made big strides forward, and now I have loaded a paper in Italian and I tried to translate it in English with the help of Google Translator, and I don't want to say I succeeded, but it was a big help, let's put it this way. So I think that young people do have a possibility at this point of interacting operating in a much easier way than what was the case in the previous generations. And at the same time, there may be the first generation that, to use an obsolete maybe expression, that has a life fate, a common life fate, which is strongly European, because the European integration process determines to a significant extent their fate in terms of life, of career, of work, and also their opportunities. We're thinking here about freely traveling with no documents, being able to spend, if they study a period abroad, through the Erasmus programs and so on. So to conclude, we should do our utmost to take full advantage of this initiative, which is called Garanzia Giovani, so young people guarantee, youth guarantee. Maybe we can ask for more money, more commitment on behalf of the community, institutions for this to be a true success. Let's invest more in the free circulation of students. I heard with horror that a reform of the community budget wanted to cut or even eliminate the Erasmus program. Let's instead invest on programs for secondary schools, because the colleague is absolutely right. It is crucial for European students to get to know one another. It is good if they're exposed to different also learning environments, and maybe share certain textbooks, history textbooks, that tell a similar narrative, which is that of the making of Europe. There are already some fantastic books. I read one this summer by Jacques Le Goff on the formation of Europe in modern times, which could very well be a textbook for all of the European schools. And so surely enough, young people can be the protagonists in the future of European integration. And Europe must start from now to deal, let's say, in a very financially generous way in offering opportunities to young people. Professor Martinelli, would you like to add something? I'd like to propose a whole series of measures to try and develop a European identity for for youth that does not replace a national identity, but rather strengthens them. I'm talking here about common school programs, contents and exchanges. I'd like to go back to the so-called Erasmus generation. Yes, I'd like to go back to that proposal of the past of European mandatory civil service, even 2 or 3 months only, even a summer, to be spent in another European country, with a program that has a very strong social meaning, significance, that allows you to see how other Europeans live. Because there's something that destroys nationalistic bias and prejudice, is to understand that others are exactly the same as we are. And then understand the role of the media and so on. Because I'm under the impression that the younger generations at this point have a more cosmopolitan culture, but at the same time they often take what they have for granted. And it's taken for granted that you can freely circulate. For me, this is a big conquest. For me, the fact of not changing a currency every time, of not having to change and having all these coins that I need to change now, all of these things that we take for granted have been the result of efforts and success. So we shouldn't go backwards. Maybe we should stop and reflect and think what it really means to do what Euroscepticals are proposing, and also those who want to dismantle this mechanism. We would be worse off, but we need to think about it and we need to understand what is meant by this.
So now we have a question, a common university system, a school system. Would it help the construction of Europe with more possibility of education for young people? Yes, it's been said here by Professor Martinelli. So what are the difficulties to create such a system, so a unique school system for the entire Europe? Is it something feasible?
Sounds like a wonderful, but a little utopian, I'm afraid, idea, at least as things stand for now. There's a massive general nationalism theory that basically tells you that the basic, big one way that nationalism and national identity is reproduced is through school education. That is where we're socialized into who we are vis-a-vis who the others are. And I think essentially, so in the very start of this conference today, someone spoke about armies and the fact that we don't have one European army. You mentioned it a bit earlier. This is the question of sovereignty. It's the question of how much countries want to pool the sovereignty, and education is a fundamental part. If you lose, if the state loses or gives up, I think, some control of the education system, it does lose control of its citizens, or of the loyalty of its citizens. So whereas I completely agree, I think it would be a brilliant idea, because that is the one way to teach people of how other people are and bring them closer, exchange programs and a common history textbook. That would be beautiful, but so difficult, I would say, because you see our history, for example, in Greece is so confrontational. It's so vis-a-vis who the enemy other is, that it would be very difficult to find a common one, say, with another EU country like Germany or Italy, who, we do love, but they did invade us, and, we did beat, actually. So it's not that easy to find one common historical narrative, and I'm afraid that the states would not want to pool that sovereignty. They would be against, because that would mean losing a lot of control. So it's a difficulty.
Professor Ferrera che voleva...
And Professor Ferrera would like to interact. Yes, I do agree. I agree the educational schooling systems, along with the armies and the currency, are distinctive traits that characterize a national identity as well as a national sovereignty. So I'm not expecting the member states to come to an agreement in terms to standardizing the school programs. A certain level of standardization in terms of the curricula is there, but very little has been done in terms of really standardizing their programs. So when talking about Europe, and I'm sure Alberto agrees with me, we probably, especially today, give the government's role an excessive importance. It is very true that European institutions are basically controlled by the governments, and there's one of them, which is called the Council, that is made up by the representatives of the national governments. But in the last 20 to 30 years, and especially amongst young people, there has been a process of Europeanization of society, so movements have been created that are not supranational or international, but rather transnational, which opens up the way to, for example, experimenting with common curricula that are oriented towards the principles of a European identity rather than a national one. Well, these activities can be started via initiatives undertaken by different governments. So Business Europe, for example, the European Entrepreneurs Association, or the European Foundation, which is the association of the major European foundations, do share this
ideas, and they know all too well that all these things we're discussing today are very important for the purpose of creating a common background amongst European young people. Why don't they fund themselves such initiatives with the help of the Commission or the Parliament, for example? Or why don't they fund a system of public schools that should be free of charge or have very low fees for students so that they do not become elitarian, where people can go to as an alternative? Or I believe that Europe should be a network, or could create a network of initiatives and associations of the European civil society. So we shouldn't wait for other people to do the hard work. I mean, this is what we need and what is necessary. When in week's time we will have the anniversary of the Dallas drama, we shouldn't be waiting in nation to do something for you, but rather be the ones who do things for our nations. But talking about Europe and solidarity, we should not disregard Europe. Sometimes we don't feel that Europe is something so it comes close to us. For example, as far as the Lampedusa is concerned, so shipwrecking, all these shipwreckings should no longer occur. Why doesn't the European Union intervene to resolve the problems we have in Italy? It's quite a very trenchant statement. Why don't they take a stance to prevent these tragedies to take place? It's not simply an Italian problem. It's a migrants then go to other European countries, where there are moments when it doesn't seem that there is any European solidarity at all. So the tragedy of Lampedusa, the problem of helping those migrant people that are desperate at sea, well, all those problems linked with migration that are fueling anti-European trends should be something that we have to react to. So what can we do? But where shall we start from if Europe is not making its voice heard? Well, the first and initial consideration is the following. Migration policies are not carried out at the level of the supranational union. So the migratory policies do not fall under the competences of the union, if not for those aspects that are, for example, those of free circulation of the people and so on. So first thing would be to have policies at a supranational level. If this is not the case, if this doesn't occur, then national egoisms will prevail. We have to be clear in this respect. The Lampedusa tragedy is creating indignation, piety, and sorrow for some days, and then one forgets the tragedy and literally is left alone, as been said. But if we take a look at the number of asylum seekers that has had their request accepted in Germany, we see that their number is much higher than the number of those who have been accepted here in Italy. So we have to consider this, and at the same time saying that the responsibility for hosting asylum seekers and of trying to regulate migratory flows, because we cannot open the frontiers to everybody, should be regulated at the supranational level, so there will be resources for the most exposed countries like Greece, Italy and Spain, and in the light of European policy. So we need more Europe, more of a united Europe rather than less Europe, otherwise it won't resolve the problem. These migrants will continue to come over here and will remain here, because if we would close the borders,
borders, we would be the ones who have to tackle the problems alone and on their own. I'm conducting a research for the European Commission for the Social Integration of Immigrants, and we're checking exactly what falls under the supranational level, and that is still very little, it's still very limited. Then, of course, we need other tools and instruments, as I said during my presentation, because we have progressively shifted sovereignty shares, but if we continue to do so, also in the migration field, and do not increase the level of solidarity and commitment at the supranational level, we won't resolve the problem anyway. So we should consider these episodes and, of course, avoid them from occurring again, but we should not consider them as simply as an opportunity for indignation or for feeling moved by that, but they should be taken an opportunity to proceed in the process of political union. Okay, we have considered this engine. Maybe the engine has got some manufacturing problems, but the engine is not working in this moment, and we're under risk of being left stranded in the middle of the desert highway, and nobody can rescue us. In this moment, it is quite, one might tend to believe that getting off that car would be the only possibility to to be rescued. But I understand I'm asking you something difficult, acting as mechanicals here. Mechanics can be complicated, but where should we start from in Europe, Professor Daphne, in order to make that car still be driving alongside humanity and the road of humanity? Where should we start from in constructing Europe?
È preoccupata, gli ho fatto un domandone.
So it was a long question.
Deciphering where the car is going and if it's going to the right place. So I'm not quite clear I've got the question, but I suppose you're asking what should we do to make sure that the European Union doesn't disintegrate? Is that the question?
E anche riprenda a camminare, oltre che non esplode.
Also, it should continue to run, of course.
If I knew I'd be working for the European Union is the quick question, but I would say that I think there are two important things. First thing, I think we're overestimating the crisis. I really think we are, because if you look at it, okay, so there's an economic crisis and a lot of countries are having a rising Euroscepticism. But then again, are they? If we look at the United Kingdom, where I live, everybody's Eurosceptic. Everybody was Eurosceptic. It doesn't even have an economic crisis. If you look at the rise of Eurosceptic parties, like Pim Fortuyn in the Netherlands in the 1990s, you'll see that they were actually on the rise without high levels of immigration created by economic crisis and without economic crisis itself. So, and again, as I said in the beginning, if you even look at the economic crisis now, you'll see that there's a lot of countries that have economic crisis and don't have that much Euroscepticism and perhaps don't have that much right-wing extremism. So the question is the EU in such a crisis as we're making out? I'm not sure, is the first thing. And the second is, well, what to do? Political union versus economic union, I think, is one of the answers, and how to accommodate, because, okay, if you want my personal opinion, I'm very pro-Europe, because Europe is very, very helpful for me, because I think that the European Union is a good idea. It's allowed me to study, to work abroad. It's actually given a lot of opportunities to students of mine, to the life that I've been living. So I think the EU is a good thing. But we do need to take and understand why some parties and some people are actually Eurosceptic. We can't completely ignore or dismiss hundreds of thousands of people that are actually opting for parties that are against. Now, what do? We educate. As we said, I think that is fundamental. And if you look at it in a cost-benefit analysis, well, maybe the EU has to persuade these people why it's more beneficial for these countries to stay in the EU than to opt out. I mean, the UK is going to have a referendum as to whether to stay or leave if the Conservative Party is voted again. That's partly a response of its domestic political issue, how the Conservatives might respond to UKIP. But there should also be something that the British people should feel loyal to or affiliated to the UK. So I think what we should do is a two-way process. The EU should also try to persuade why these countries would benefit from staying in the Union. It's not a very easy thing. Education and media are very important, I would say.
rimetto la tuta del meccanico che la professoressa insomma un po' rifiuta.
So, in fact, you have refused the idea of a mechanic. Actually, if you have to mend the car, then it's better to work for the European Union. But we're receiving questions in this respect. What will be the instrument or the tool that can guarantee a community of European states, as they are so different? The many attempts that have been made were not successful in a way, some people are stating here, but in a political union you would also need a bank union that realigns the economic interests. Professor Ferrara, should we start off from the economy? Do you think we should start by setting up a European bank that has different powers as compared to the current bank, or should we start from the political sphere? Well, a bank union is absolutely necessary. I do agree on that, and there is a very much detailed agenda in this respect. I hope that amongst the priorities of the Italian presidency, this will be one of the things we'll consider more closely, but trying to act as a technician and repair the car, as we were saying earlier, is very important, especially as far as the political common intents are concerned. So can we become a political community within a system that is so heterogeneous from a cultural standpoint as this system we have in Europe? So going back to the metaphor of the technician who should repair the car, what type of car are we confronted with? What type of car is Europe? Europe is actually standing on two wheels, is a bicycle, is not a car. It doesn't stand on four wheels. So on the one side, we should consider all the features that provide a community identity and legitimate it via consensus. The first wheel is the classical wheel of liberal democracy, i.e. the Europe of citizens, and the Lisbon Treaty clearly states that one of the principles of the Union is that the Union is founded on its European citizens and on the European people. So there are two wheels, and two are the main foundations of Europe. As far as the peoples are concerned, in recent times, in recent years, and especially in the face of the crisis, there has been a decrease in solidarity mechanisms, as we heard before, and they don't feel that they belong to one and the same boat, that they are sharing something. What type of rules, solidarity or living together can be conceived within a community of different peoples coming together? Well, I believe this is one of the crucial question marks. I've been going through the pages written by an author that probably many of you, of the students here, are reading right now, Max Weber's it's a Max Weber statement. Amongst the various types of community, Max Weber talks about the neighborhood community. He was not just considering one's neighbor in at home, but he considered the tribes, the peoples, the different peoples. What is a neighborhood community? Well, it is a community of different entities and subjects who are condemned by geography or by their very physical location in a certain space, and therefore do share a certain set of interests. There is an interdependency of interests. They're not sharing identity maybe, but they're sharing interests. In the course of time, this interdependence generates, according to Max Weber, a sentiment of sober fraternity, which is in link with the typical patterns of the nation state, with national memories, with common battles and fights, but the very fact that we belong to one and the same boat, so to say. So what are the principles of a good neighborhood that should apply? Weber says primitive ethical principles, and he mentions three principles. The first one is the biblical one, i.e. don't do other people what you don't, or what you wouldn't like other people would do to you, which is fundamental. And the second one is very important in light of the current situation. You do not bargain prices with your neighbors, and if necessary, you can lend them money for no interest. Mutuum is the Latin word which means lending money, and without having to consider if you're applying an equitable interest rate, but actually you're lending money in the conviction that this goes in the interests of both parties, also in the interest of the lender. So we have to go back to this concept. Unfortunately, we've gone below a certain threshold. We're no longer a good neighborhood community. We've become too complex and complicated in calculating what you're giving to me, what I'm earning. And this calculation nowadays has become really impossible because there is no cognitive way for us to identify the enormous web network of different flows going from one country to the next one that would probably only enable the god of the economy to realize who's losing and who's winning, or who's losing, who's gaining. The Germans seem to be the losers because they've got to pay for everybody, but this can't be true. It can't be true because they've been the biggest beneficiaries of the euro stability, and the most reliable economies do acknowledge this. So it is no longer possible to know exactly who's losing and who's gaining. We're now well beyond this situation. I mean, we cannot fix the problem today, and therefore we have to go back and recover the good proximity or neighborhood concept and re-establish the principle that you don't want to negotiate prices with your neighbors in order to re-establish mutual aid principles that are linked not just to the generosity of Holland, Germany, Finland vis-à-vis Greece or Italy, but are absolutely necessary in an interdependent system that makes it possible for each single member state to face the interdependence with the national instruments. Now, Professor Alberto Martinelli is the floor goes to you, but we should strike a balance in terms of euro.
Gli aggiungo anche appunto anche a lei, insomma, quale pezzo del motore, dov'è lo spintone?
Of Euro-nationalism. So what is, where should we push the pedal, the gas pedal in this respect? Well, actually, Maurizio has made an important statement. The Treaty of Lisbon tells us that we are European in two ways, as European citizens in the first place, and also as part of a people that coincide to one of the member states and has got its own bodies for political representation. This is where we have to work in order to develop this supranational union and further develop it. Now, going to some concrete proposals at the political level, some things can be done straight away. They do not need, we do not need to review the current treaties. And who should be doing that? Everybody, all together. The citizens should, of course, lobby their governments. And there's one proposal that seems to be a shared proposal, but in spite of some difficulties in this very moment, and they're linked with the next European elections. Every single European party federation and each single party in the different European countries that will go for the elections in Europe should submit its own candidate as the President of the Commission. This is probably easy. I mean, we should also have the President of the Commission, of the Council, of the Union, but at least as a candidate for the Commission. But that's not enough. Every party should say, we candidate this person for the presidency of the Commission, but at the same time, this president should clearly state what the 5-year program of that chairman will look like if he goes, if he becomes the president of the commission. So we can decide not just because we believe in this or that part, but also we make we base our decision on the credibility of that candidate. And this is a proposal that was made by the CDU, the Christian Democrats in Germany. And it seems it's going forward. This project is going forward, but I'm not sure it will be successful. Those who are not going to do this will lose an extra plus point in their campaign. The second point that is also very simple is to try and clarify to the citizens and voters that the next parliament will also have the role of a constituent
un testo di Costituzione europea, ma crea una convenzione che dovrà redigere un testo
they will set up a convention for the drafting of the text of a constitution that will have to be submitted to all the European citizens. So these things should be done, and on top of these two, there are a series of other steps. Some of them are very hard for us to carry out, but should be considered. For example, changing the union, the form of government within the union. I'm talking about the federal union, and I'm going back to the question of where is the federal union today. The federal union should not reproduce the American or the German model. It should be an innovative solution that is suitable to the European community of today. So what is the advantage of federal unions? Well, they can reunite the protection of the autonomy of the single constituent part along with the strength of a major political force. In order to do this, you need to strengthen the Parliament as a representative chamber of all the European citizens. And I'm going back to one of the wheels of the bicycles, i.e. the citizens. The other wheel was are the people of the member states. We have to have a representativeness within the Council. The Council would lose its power as it would become something very similar to the Senate in the federal system. On top of this, we would need the bank union, of course, that comes later, at a later point in time. This should become a European bank that has all the powers of a central bank that can issue Eurobonds and so on and so forth. Then the union should have its own budget that at least partially is funded to its own tax inflows and should not depend on the payments of the member states. Otherwise the union will always be very weak. A carbon tax or a financial transaction tax could be considered for the purpose of funding the budget of the union in order to develop the EU system. And the Commission should become a real form of government of the Union and have a vote of trust and faith by everybody, and has competencies in the economic and political sphere, leaving to the member states a series of other competencies, for example, in the field of social policies. But I do understand it's not an easy way ahead, but it can be a gradual way ahead. If we do not get the consensus of the 28 member states, we have to consider the majority vote, not the unanimity vote whereby the veto right applies. So we have to use the instrument of reinforced cooperations, whereby some member states can proceed more rapidly than others and leave an option to the other states of whether they want to come in or step in at a later point in time or not. Otherwise, we're not all rowing in the same direction, and sooner or later we'll fall off the bicycle.
The last round, we had started off from nationalism, so this restless germ that comes back in the history every time that it seems to be defeated. That's good also, that's done well in the history as well. So we are asked by one of our participants, but the austerity policies, are they the responsible for nationalistic movements? I'd like to ask Ferrera and also Professor Daphne to understand if maybe things can change in the economic policy done with certain tools but also with certain recipes. So is there this link? Or yes, of course there is, and this is true from a strictly political standpoint, because obviously the adoption, a rigid adoption of this paradigm of austerity on behalf of the European institutions has exacerbated the constraints which are present on a national level in a moment of crisis, and has prevented national governments from using some of the tools, obviously such as social amortizers, in an anti-cyclical manner. And we know that these welfare means need to be used exactly when a crisis is present. Otherwise, a crisis will create poverty. If you ask Greece to cut unemployment subsidies, or if you, for instance, minimum pensions, in a moment of crisis, it's obvious that you will create more inequality, more poverty, frustration, and you will throw a shadow over Europe, transforming it into this terrible stepmother, and you will fuel Euroscepticism, obviously, in this way. But there is another, I don't know if this was incorporated in your question, there's another question, which is this: if austerity is the right recipe. Well, I think that there is no right or wrong recipe, at least theoretically speaking, because nothing of what man thinks or builds is completely false or true. Our doctrines, as Popper taught us, are built only on water, practically, and we will know if they work only when they will be tested. And the test of a goodness of a pudding, you have it when you actually eat it, as the British say. So I don't think that the flavor of this cake, of this pudding, has been very pleasant. To leave the metaphor, I mean that the recipe of austerity has really had an outcome that's been completely positive. Take Ireland, for instance. After 3 or 4 years of austerity, it's working its way out of the crisis, and some are beginning, as you know, using it as an example that there can be an expansionist type of austerity, but in other bigger countries this is not happening. So I believe that you need to take stock of the fact that this paradigm, if not wrong, is at least limited, is incomplete, it is not completely effective, and so with great humbleness you need to think about a change in the paradigm that puts the growth at the center. Mrs. Halikiopoulou, do you share this? The era of rigor has not yielded the hoped for fruits, and so you need to find a new recipe, which is not easy to find. But if we continue along these lines, we risk moving backwards, not only for a growth that's not there, but even for a concept of a Europe which will be disintegrating itself. Should we change the policy of rigor?
Okay, I understand there are 2 components to the question. So onto the first component, which was, does austerity cause the rise of these nationalist movements? I will differ with you, and I'm going to say something very controversial. I don't think it does. We're here in the Science for Peace conference. My science is political science. and more specifically comparative political science. So the first thing that I think when I hear a statement, does austerity, or any statement, but does austerity cause the rise of nationalist movements, I think comparatively. And I think, well, that would mean two things. It would mean that other countries facing crisis should also have rise of nationalist movements, and it would also mean that countries that don't face crisis do not have nationalist movements. Neither statements are true. Before the crisis, we had a lot of powerful nationalist movements, as I've mentioned, Pim Fortuyn in the Netherlands, many cases, even in Greece with the Laos Party or other, perhaps not right-wing, but other types of nationalist movements. Now with the crisis, only Greece has experienced the rise of the far right. I believe the Lega declined in your latest elections. Ireland, no far right-wing party at all, ever. Portugal, no. Spain, no. Why not? What does that tell us? I'm not saying that the crisis is irrelevant, and I'm not saying that austerity is irrelevant, but I'm saying there has to be something else there, possibly a structural condition or something else that combining with austerity makes this rise happen. It's a classic paradigm, right? So this statement was first used to explain the rise of fascism and Nazism in interwar Europe. But again, so it's the social pathology thesis. Crisis creates a pathology, which is interpreted into the support for extreme right-wing movements. In the interwar period, America didn't experience the rise of the far right, but Nazi Germany did, and so did fascist Italy. Why? Why do we have this very interesting variation? So I will differ, and I will say that crisis will only lead to the rise of nationalist movements under very specific circumstances, and in the current economic crisis, it is only Greece that actually meets those circumstances. Maybe we should look elsewhere. I believe in some of the polls in non-crisis or countries that aren't experiencing that much crisis, like the Front National is first in some of the polls, and there isn't that much of a crisis.
Francia.
In Austria, the far right did very, very well, but it's not experiencing a similar crisis. The true Finns in Finland are doing very well, but no similar economic crisis. I think we need to look deeper into the structural conditions that may be relevant to the rise of these nationalist movements to understand them, not just crisis. But on to the question about whether austerity is the right recipe, I would agree, and I would say I don't think austerity is the right recipe, at least not in Greece. Because perhaps sharing some of the problems of Italy, we have a lot of corruption in Greece, and we have a lot of patronage, we have a lot of economic problems that austerity doesn't solve, simply because those who evade tax, to be blunt, right, those who evade tax and those who benefit from the system have not been addressed. So austerity is very selective. It tackles those members of the population that cannot not pay for austerity, but there are a lot of others that don't actually they don't have to pay for that. So because it's selective, I don't think it's successful. They're now considering raising tax again, VAT, to 23%. I'm not an economist, but I don't think that's a very good idea. The economy cannot move if everybody has to deal with such big taxation, whereas all their salaries and pensions and economic support has been cut. So I think boost the economy more than austerity, but I don't think austerity necessarily leads to economic crisis.
Interessante la professoressa, diciamo,
Very interesting, Professor.
un nesso non fisso.
I wouldn't say it's a fixed link between austerity and the birth of nationalism according to your point of view. I'd like to end now with Mr. Martinelli. Obviously, I will ask him too if the road is rigor or a new economic recipe. From this point of view, there's been an evolution in the common thought recently. Up to recently, in fact, we all thought that austerity could be the only path. Now lessons have taught us that probably it was not. Yes, referring to a question here, the relationship between the populism and the incapability of the institutions of providing answers to citizens.
l'austerity non
if
è
austerity
la benzina
is
che mette
not
fuoco al movimento
the
anti-europeista,
fuel
se in questo momento diciamo un
fueling
movimento
anti-European
forte di
thought,
pancia del paese
if
è rappresentato in
a
questo
great
senso,
movement
è
of the
quello appunto del
country,
Movimento 5 Stelle,
a great strength of movement we see here in the Five-Star Movement by Beppe Grillo, which is created in opposition of the engine of the against the institutions of the countries, against the privileges of these. Then there's also other things such as austerity and Europe, which are attacked by, but the true spring that has created so much consensus around the Five-Star Movement has been the detachment between the institutions and the citizens. Is this our enemy that doesn't allow us to get to a better relationship? The need to create a better relationship between institutions and citizens? Well, first of all, I wanted to say something to Daphne. When in the book I say, and I also mentioned this in my presentation, that the crisis contributes, alongside many other factors, to the resumption of these populist movements, I don't want to say that there's a direct correlation between the seriousness of the crisis and these movements, but I say that the crisis, as it increases internal inequalities amongst the different economies, amongst the different countries, creates. In those countries doing better, in those countries doing worse, it fuels this, I think. In general, rigor policies, these are necessary when we reach certain critical thresholds, I think, because they should demonstrate that there's something else that needs to be done. And this is repeated almost all the time by Paul Krugman. We need to invest on growth because this increases the denominator, so even the debt increases, the wealth produced is greater. But we need to explain this better if this is really possible. If, for instance, after the famous summer of 2 years ago in our country, we had continued not doing anything, happily, and this wasn't possible because the Brussels imposed on us rather unpleasant things, but some necessary things. Well, the famous spread, this word that unfortunately we got to know, would have rocketed. The debt would have gone up, and a country that had already been stagnating for more than a decade would have become worse off with outcomes that we can't really even imagine at the moment. So we need to assess things on a case-by-case basis. Then to persevere, to continue with rigor policies can obviously be negative. So now we need to change, but I think that this is pretty much clear to everybody. Now coming to this, the question of what is the possible solution and the relationship between citizens and institutions. Every time the ruling class cannot show that it possesses that integrity, which is a requirement, and those skills, those capabilities to face problems and to provide solutions, it's obvious that this protest increases. And this can be a populist one, nationalistic in the sense that one tries to find a support within a community of equals, and populist because obviously it comes very easy to say that the whole responsibility is on the shoulders of those who govern, especially if they are distant elites. So obviously the correlation does exist. But going back to another question, federalism on the supranational level must be accompanied by a federal reform within the member states. I don't understand this from the Lega Nord party. Don't they understand that there's a strong connection between internal federalism and European one? They are against Europe because they would want to decentralization. I mean, the two things are, they go hand in hand, really. So the type of political player that is more effective at governing very complex problems are the great supranational unions that succeed in making certain decisions on a top level for common problems, and they leave lot of independence to be adjusted to the various situations at the national and subnational levels. And this is not something abstract of institutional politics. This is the answer. And the other thing saying, no, we shall just have some small, consistent entities which are consistent culturally, so we will be stronger. No, we will be weaker. And again, with reference to another question, how can we work for this project? Are there European movements? Yes, we do so. We have the famous Federalist movement, for instance. We have a lot of groups, transnational associations that work together to try to provide answers to concrete problems. You need to be very concrete here in trying to refine the engine in the machine. We've made specific proposals. We have foundations. Why don't they think about a schooling path that should be offered not for the rich ones only, but I would say, or to everybody? A European, for instance, a European high school, this would be excellent. Civil service for 2 months, new friends, get to know more things. I mean, young people are very often idealistic, and they also would like to help somebody who needs. The media, why don't we still don't have a true system, at least a European public channel? Why doesn't this exist? Because regardless of the various efforts made by the national TVs, these European programs are not very successful. They need to be made more sexy, more enticing. All of these things are concrete. They should be done. Otherwise, we'll just go backwards. It's no tragedy, but I think that it's a less desirable future. Even because if we are here at the Veronese Foundation, it's because we want to go on. We want to proceed with our discussions, such as the ones that we've just had, because European movements are also created by discussing amongst people that may have different opinions, but which contribute. So thank you very much to Mr. Ferrera, Mrs. Daphne, Halikiopoulou, sorry for mispronouncing, Alberto Martinelli, and I'd like to thank you all. There will be other important debates on other topics still connected to science. Thank you for your participation.
Bene.